December 16, 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The morning began in silence. A frozen stillness hung over the dark pines, thick with fog and snow. American soldiers, young, exhausted, many barely 20, stood in shallow foxholes, clutching cold rifles. They thought this was a quiet sector, a place to rest after months of fighting in France. Then the ground trembled. Out of the mist came the thunder, 1,000 German guns opening fire at once. The forest erupted in flame. Shells tore through trees, splinters and smoke filling the air. Communication lines were cut. Convoys exploded on narrow roads. Within hours, entire American divisions were cut off. It wasn't just another attack. It was a storm, the last, desperate counteroffensive of Nazi Germany. Through the chaos, commanders tried to hold lines that no longer existed. Towns fell. Units vanished. Radios went silent. To the Germans, it looked like victory, the Allies in retreat, the American front collapsing under pressure. But hidden beneath the confusion was something else. A pattern forming. A withdrawal that wasn't just panic, but precision. And within days, the trap would close. By late 1944, the war in Europe seemed nearly over. Paris had been liberated. German cities were under constant Allied bombing. The Red Army was pushing in from the east, crushing everything in its path. On paper, Hitler's empire was collapsing. But deep inside the Reich Chancellery, Hitler refused to accept defeat. He was convinced that one final decisive blow could split the Western Allies, force a negotiated peace, and buy time to deal with the Soviets. His plan was code-named Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. It was audacious, almost delusional. The idea: launch a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, drive across the Meuse River, and seize the port of Antwerp. Doing so would split the American and British armies in half, trapping the northern Allied forces in Belgium and Holland. Many of his generals doubted it could work. The Ardennes was rugged, heavily wooded, and filled with narrow, icy roads. It was considered the least likely place for a major offensive, which was exactly why Hitler chose it. The operation required secrecy. In late November, under cover of darkness, more than 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks, including the feared Panther and Tiger II, moved into position. Even local civilians had no idea what was coming. Fuel depots were camouflaged. Radios went silent. Troops marched only at night. The Wehrmacht assembled 3 major armies. The 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, including SS Panzer divisions that had once terrorized the Eastern Front. The 5th Panzer Army under Otto von Manschufel, tasked with the main drive toward Bastogne and the Meuse. The 7th Army providing southern cover. They were low on fuel, short on ammunition, and facing overwhelming air superiority from the Allies. But Hitler believed in surprise, and the winter weather would help. 4 days before the assault, heavy fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft. The skies were silent. A perfect shroud for the storm about to break. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, confidence had turned into routine. American commanders saw the Ardennes as a quiet sector, a place for resting worn-out divisions and rotating fresh troops into the line. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived and inexperienced, occupied positions east of St. Vith. Veterans of the 28th Division were scattered along thin defensive lines. Few expected trouble. Intelligence reports suggested German forces were crumbling. Some officers even spoke of being home by Christmas. Then, at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the illusion shattered. The German barrage began, one of the heaviest of the entire war. More than 1,500 artillery pieces fired in unison, followed by the rumble of panzers emerging from the fog. Communications were instantly crippled. American units fought isolated, surrounded, cut off from supply. Villages like Losheim, Bullingen, and Clairvaux fell within hours. German commandos in captured Allied uniforms infiltrated behind lines, spreading confusion and misinformation. Road signs were turned, convoys misdirected. Even Eisenhower's headquarters struggled to piece together what was happening. The front, 80 miles wide, was collapsing, fast. In those first brutal days, It looked like the Allies had underestimated the Wehrmacht one last time. But as the lines bent and bulged, something unexpected began to take shape, an emerging order inside the chaos. And it would soon turn Germany's apparent triumph into the beginning of its end. The German spearhead tore through the snow-covered Ardennes like a blade. Entire American regiments were swallowed by the offensive before realizing its scale. The 106th Infantry Division, positioned on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge, was surrounded within 48 hours. Nearly 7,000 men were forced to surrender, one of the largest mass captures of U.S. troops in the European theater. Roads jammed with fleeing vehicles and refugees. Tanks skidded across frozen bridges. Radio messages came in fragments, desperate, broken calls for reinforcements. To any outside observer, the U.S. Army seemed on the verge of total defeat. But amidst the confusion, discipline held. While some units fell back, others made defiant stands. Near Elsenborn Ridge, the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions dug in and refused to yield. Using the high ground and pre-registered artillery fire, they stopped the advance of SS Panzer divisions, inflicting massive losses. Their defense slowed the German timetable, forcing armored columns into narrow, clogged roads. Further south, the small town of Bastogne became the hinge of the entire battle. It was a crossroads town, 7 roads branching out across the Ardennes. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement in the region. By December 20th, Bastogne was surrounded. Inside were elements of the 101st Airborne Division, the 10th Armored Division, and scattered artillery units, around 11,000 men under the command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. Outside, nearly 50,000 German troops encircled them. Supplies were dwindling. Ammunition was rationed. The temperature plunged below freezing. Men burned wooden fences for warmth. Yet, when German envoys demanded surrender, McAuliffe sent a one-word reply: nuts. It wasn't bravado. It was a message of defiance, and it carried across every front line. Behind the scenes, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced the hardest command decision of the war. Reports from the front were contradictory, often hours old. He and General Omar Bradley realized this was no minor attack. It was a full-scale counteroffensive, a threat that could split the Allied armies. In response, Eisenhower ordered one of the most complex rapid redeployments in modern warfare. Divisions from north and south were redirected toward the Bulge forming in the Ardennes. To the south, General George S. Patton was preparing his own offensive into the Saar region. When word reached him of the crisis, he paused, looked at his staff, and made a decision that stunned his subordinates. He would turn his entire Third Army, more than 100,000 men and 400 tanks, 90 degrees north, through ice and mud, to strike the German flank and relieve Bastogne. It was a logistical nightmare, hundreds of miles of movement across frozen terrain, with limited fuel and supply. But if successful, it could reverse the entire battle. Meanwhile, to the Germans, everything still looked like victory. They believed the Americans were in retreat, disorganized, broken, ready to collapse. But they didn't see the pattern forming. They didn't see that every retreating American unit was falling back to higher, stronger ground, forming a natural pocket. And they didn't realize that the defeat they celebrated was already shaping into a trap. 1. The tactical angle. At first glance, the U.S. withdrawal looked chaotic. Units fell back under pressure, abandoning villages and roadblocks. But behind those movements lay a series of improvised defensive lines, created not by grand design, but by instinct and experience. American field commanders began using terrain to their advantage. The Ardennes was a maze of ridges, forests, and narrow valleys, perfect for ambushes. Every mile the Germans advanced, their columns stretched thinner. Their tanks, built for open terrain, found themselves trapped in bottlenecks and icy choke points. At Elsenborn Ridge, American artillery became the great equalizer. The defenders had pre-sighted coordinates, meaning they could rain shells on every road and bridge in range. German panzers moved forward, and disappeared under explosions. It was one of the rare moments where outnumbered infantry held back elite SS armored divisions. Further south, the same pattern emerged. American lines seemed to break, but then folded backward into stronger positions. Each fallback point delayed the German timetable. Every hour lost meant less fuel, less daylight, and fewer chances to reach the Meuse. The defeat was creating a perfect battlefield geometry, a bulge that was both visible and vulnerable. 2. The weather and terrain angle. When the offensive began, nature sided with Germany. Dense fog grounded Allied aircraft. Snow muffled tank engines. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, finally had a chance to operate without fear of Allied air dominance. But the same conditions that helped the attack also hid its flaws. German supply lines were stretched across frozen roads, fuel trucks crawling through mud and snow. The terrain slowed their armor to walking speed. The deeper they went, the more exposed they became. For the Americans, the weather was both curse and cover. While air support was grounded, small groups of infantry used forests to launch surprise counterattacks, then vanish into the trees. Patrols operated almost silently, using snow-covered paths to strike supply convoys. And as days passed, the weather began to turn. Temperatures rose slightly. The fog began to thin. Allied pilots waited for the moment the skies would clear, a moment that would change everything. 3. The intelligence angle. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't just a failure of foresight, it was a masterclass in deception. Hitler's forces had disguised movements so effectively that Allied intelligence dismissed early reports of a German buildup. Field agents warned of unusual troop concentrations in the Eifel region, but those warnings were buried under confidence and complacency. Once the attack began, radio silence on the German side created another illusion. The Allies had come to rely on intercepted transmissions, but now, with the airwaves quiet, they assumed German communications had collapsed. In truth, it was a deliberate silence before the strike. Meanwhile, Otto Skorzeny's Operation Greif added another layer of confusion. German commandos, fluent in English and wearing captured American uniforms, slipped behind enemy lines to change signposts, misdirect convoys, and sabotage bridges. They caused panic out of proportion to their actual numbers. The result was chaos, but also opportunity. As American commanders adapted, they began feeding false information back through the same confusion networks, misleading German scouts and artillery observers. By the end of the first week, both sides were fighting ghosts, illusions shaped by the fog of war. And through that fog, the U.S. Army began quietly forming its counterstroke. 4. The leadership angle. In the chaos of the Ardennes, leadership decided everything. Orders were often delayed, radios cut, and frontline officers left to make life-or-death choices on their own. For the Germans, command was rigid. Field marshals like Gerd von Rundstedt and Otto von Manschufel operated under Hitler's constant interference. Every decision, every deviation, required his approval. Even as conditions worsened, Hitler demanded that his armies press on toward Antwerp, refusing to acknowledge logistical collapse. The Americans, by contrast, adapted. Eisenhower gave broad directives, then trusted his commanders to act on the ground. Omar Bradley managed the northern sector from his headquarters in Luxembourg, coordinating defense through a broken communication web. But it was George S. Patton who defined the counterattack. Known for aggression and audacity, he saw the opportunity faster than anyone. Within 48 hours of the German breakthrough, Patton reoriented his entire Third Army, a maneuver military historians still call one of the greatest pivots in modern warfare. While snow and ice crippled most movement, his convoys rolled day and night. Engineers repaired bridges as tanks crossed them. Columns stretched for miles, headlights blacked out, guided only by compass and instinct. Patton's men reached the southern edge of Bastogne by December 23, just as the skies began to clear. The trap was almost ready to spring. 5. The human angle. The Battle of the Bulge was fought not only by generals but by freezing, exhausted men who refused to break. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne dug into frozen ground, trading rifle fire and mortar rounds with German troops who vastly outnumbered them. Medics worked in basements lit by candles. Ammunition was so scarce that soldiers stripped cartridges from fallen comrades. On Christmas Eve, German artillery pounded the town relentlessly. Yet morale held. Chaplains prayed beside foxholes. Men shared rations of frozen chocolate and tinned meat. Letters from home were read aloud in whispers. Across the lines, German soldiers faced their own misery: frostbite, hunger, and dwindling fuel. Many had been promised a quick victory and now found themselves stalled in snowdrifts, surrounded by wrecked vehicles. The human endurance on both sides turned the Ardennes into a graveyard of steel and willpower. The difference was that one side fought for conquest, the other for survival. And that made all the difference when the trap began to close. 6. The enemy's perspective. To the German High Command, the early days of the offensive looked like triumph. Columns of captured Americans marched east. Fuel dumps were seized. Hitler declared that the spirit of 1940 had returned. But inside the field headquarters, doubt grew. Rundstedt knew the advance was slowing. Fuel consumption was higher than expected. The terrain was strangling supply lines. Bridges that should have been taken intact were destroyed by retreating engineers. Manchufel, the most capable of the commanders, realized something worse. The Americans weren't retreating randomly. Their lines were curving inward, forming a crescent that funneled German armor straight into the center of the Bulge. By December 22, the 6th Panzer Army had stalled before Elsenborn Ridge, unable to break through. The 5th Panzer Army was bogged down around Bastogne. The 7th was exposed on its flank. What had looked like a corridor to Antwerp was now a pocket, deep, narrow, and vulnerable. Still, orders from Berlin demanded attack. Every hesitation was treated as defeatism. The generals obeyed, and drove their men further into the American jaws. The trap was set. All it needed now was the moment to close. December 23, 1944, the Ardennes. After a week of fog, the sky finally opened. The morning light revealed a sight unseen since the battle began. Sunlight over white fields, black smoke rising through the snow. For the first time in days, Allied pilots could see the ground. And they went to work immediately. Hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts, Typhoons, and B-26 Marauders took off from bases in France and England. Flying low over the forest, they strafed German convoys caught on icy roads, bombed fuel trucks, and destroyed bridges critical to resupply. The roar of engines echoed through the valleys, the sound of the trap snapping shut. German tanks that had advanced boldly under the fog now had nowhere to hide. Columns of armor burned along the narrow routes to St. Vith, Houffalize, and Bastogne. The Luftwaffe, already crippled by fuel shortages, could barely respond. On the ground, American artillery joined in. For the first time since the offensive began, the Allies had a clear picture of the battlefield. Using aerial reconnaissance, they targeted concentrations of enemy armor with precision fire. Roads once packed with panzers turned into wreckage-strewn choke points. In Bastogne, relief was on the way. Patton's Third Army, the same force that had pivoted north against all odds, reached the outskirts of the town by the evening of December 26. Lead elements of the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, broke through the German encirclement. When Abrams' Sherman tanks rolled into Bastogne, the men of the 101st Airborne stood from their foxholes, dirty, frostbitten, and smiling. The trap had worked. The German commanders still didn't fully grasp it. They believed they were under temporary setback, that with regrouping, they could resume the offensive. But the Allies had already shifted the momentum completely. Eisenhower ordered a coordinated counteroffensive from north and south. British forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery tightened the upper flank. Patton's divisions pressed from below. What had been a bulge in the Allied line was now collapsing inward, compressing the German armies trapped inside. Even Hitler's most trusted generals began to see the inevitable. Their fuel was gone. Reinforcements were delayed by Allied bombing. And now, the very ground that had promised concealment was turning against them, an open field for air assault. Still, Hitler refused to allow retreat. He ordered continued attacks toward Bastogne, demanding that it be captured at all costs. The costs, however, were already beyond calculation. By December 27, entire panzer columns were immobilized. Some tanks were abandoned, others were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. Infantrymen, cut off from supply, scavenged from wrecks and frozen corpses. The American lines, once scattered, were now united, a tightening ring of steel around the fading German advance. But the fight wasn't over yet. The Wehrmacht, though cornered, still had one chance left, a breakout attempt through the same narrow corridor they had created. And what happened next would finally expose the full scale of the trap the Germans had walked into. December 28 to 31, 1944, the Ardennes front. The German advance was over. What remained now was survival. Panzers that had once charged confidently toward the Meuse were stranded without fuel, their crews shivering in the snow. Supply convoys lay destroyed, their cargoes burning. The same narrow forest roads that had carried the offensive forward now became choke points of retreat, crowded, exposed, and under constant Allied attack. From the air, American and British pilots hunted columns like prey. The bright white snow turned black with smoke. Allied bombers struck bridges at Houffalize, La Roche, and St. Vith, sealing escape routes. Every path out of the Bulge was being methodically closed. On the ground, German units fought desperate rearguard actions to buy time. Yet every mile gained by the Allies meant the ring tightened further. At Manhay and Marquet, American tank destroyers ambushed retreating armor. At Hauton, paratroopers repelled a final push by the 2nd Panzer Division. By New Year's Eve, most German units were trapped in the frozen pockets east of Bastogne, their communications collapsing. Inside German headquarters, the mood shifted from triumph to disbelief. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, quietly told aides the offensive was lost. "We gambled too high," he said, "and now we have nothing left to play." General Otto von Manschufel, leading the 5th Panzer Army, was one of the first to recognize the scale of the disaster. He had warned Berlin weeks earlier that fuel shortages and terrain would cripple the advance. Now, he watched as his divisions, elite, well-trained, and irreplaceable, were ground down by artillery and airstrikes. The illusion of control was gone. Meanwhile, American morale surged. Patton's troops pressed forward relentlessly, clearing towns one by one. Engineers rebuilt bridges under fire. Supply lines flowed freely again. Airborne drops brought food, ammunition, and winter clothing to isolated pockets still fighting. Every action reinforced a single truth: the Allies were no longer reacting, they were dictating the fight. On January 1, 1945, Hitler launched a final, desperate move, Operation Bodenplatte, an air assault meant to cripple Allied air power on the ground. It failed catastrophically. The Luftwaffe lost over 250 aircraft and most of its remaining trained pilots in one day. The skies, once Germany's shield, now belonged entirely to the Allies. By January 8, Hitler finally authorized withdrawal. But it was too late. What had begun as a bold strike to divide the Allies ended as a shattered retreat through snow and wreckage. Thousands of German soldiers were captured. Thousands more froze to death in the forest. For the first time, even hardened German officers admitted the truth. Their breakthrough had become a self-made pocket, a trap of their own making, sealed by the very enemy they believed broken. Reports from captured staff officers reflected disbelief. One SS major reportedly told his interrogators, "We thought we had you surrounded. Then we realized it was us." The last fires of the Ardennes burned out by mid-January. What remained was a frozen graveyard of men and machines, and the undeniable proof that the war in the West was lost. And as the snow settled over the ruined towns, the question shifted from how the Americans survived to what this victory had cost on both sides. February 1945. The wounds of victory. The guns fell silent in the Ardennes, but the silence was heavy, not peaceful. What had been a forest of beauty was now a graveyard of machines and men. The snow, once pure and white, was stained with oil and blood. For the Allies, victory had come at a price few had imagined. Over 80,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire companies had vanished in the snow. Medics worked in freezing tents, hands numb, faces hollow. In Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne had held out for days without relief, survivors were found half-starved but unbroken. One paratrooper wrote in his diary, "We came here, boys. We're leaving as ghosts." For the Germans, the cost was even greater. More than 100,000 soldiers were lost, many of them irreplaceable veterans. The elite SS Panzer divisions, the pride of Hitler's army, were destroyed. Tanks left behind had their engines frozen solid or empty of fuel, their crews forced to flee on foot. Those who made it back east found no rest. They were ordered immediately to face the advancing Red Army on the Eastern Front, exhausted, outnumbered, and without hope. Strategically, the Ardennes offensive broke the last illusion that Germany could still turn the tide. The Third Reich had gambled everything on one strike, and lost. Its fuel reserves were gone. Its armored strength shattered. Its air force crippled. Within weeks, Allied troops crossed the Rhine. The road to Berlin was now open. But for the men who fought in the snow, glory was an empty word. Many never spoke about it again. They remembered the faces, the cold, the friends who didn't come back. Some carried frostbite for life. Others carried guilt for surviving when others hadn't. In the villages of Belgium and Luxembourg, civilians returned to ruins. Entire towns were burned, their churches shelled. Farmers dug bodies out of frozen fields. Children played with shell casings because there were no toys left. For them, victory was just another word for survival. And yet, amid the devastation, there was also pride. The Allies had faced their worst test of the war, and held. The line had bent, but it had not broken. The Battle of the Bulge would become the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. A final, desperate gamble that ended not with conquest, but with collapse. As one German officer later said in his memoir, "It was the last dream of victory, and it died in the snow." February, March 1945, the road beyond the Ardennes. By early February, the frozen fields of the Ardennes were quiet again. The last columns of retreating Germans disappeared into the fog toward the Rhine. Allied supply trucks rolled past burnt-out panzers, their engines still ticking in the cold. General Eisenhower visited the front and stood silently among the wrecks. He understood what this victory meant. Germany's Western Army was broken beyond repair. The Allies had paid dearly, but the outcome was irreversible now. The end was only months away. For Hitler, the failure of the Ardennes offensive shattered his remaining grip on reality. He raged at his generals, accusing them of cowardice and betrayal. Yet deep inside the Führer bunker, his world was collapsing. Without fuel or reserves, the once mighty Wehrmacht was fighting on borrowed time. In contrast, the American army that limped out of the Ardennes was hardened, forged by adversity. The Green divisions that entered Europe in 1944 were now veterans of one of the most brutal campaigns of the war. Commanders refined logistics, coordination, and winter warfare. Lessons learned in the Ardennes would later save thousands during the final push into Germany. In London, Winston Churchill called the victory an ever-famous American feat. The world took note, not just of the power of U.S. industry, but of the endurance of its soldiers. It was a turning point in perception. America was no longer seen as the inexperienced ally. It was now the backbone of the Allied advance. Meanwhile, in Berlin, ordinary citizens felt the shock. Rumors of the failed offensive in the West spread quietly, despite Nazi propaganda. For the first time, many Germans realized the war was lost. The Allies, too, were sobered. There was no joy, only grim determination. They knew what awaited across the Rhine: cities in ruins, civilians starving, concentration camps yet undiscovered. As March 1945 dawned, Patton's Third Army reached the Rhine and crossed it in force. The men who had fought in the Bulge led the way. Behind them, the graves in the snow began to melt into the soil, silent witnesses to the last great gamble of the Nazi war machine. In every war diary, one truth repeated itself. The Bulge was the beginning of the end. And so it was. The defeat in the Ardennes did not just end an offensive, it ended the myth of German invincibility. It proved that even in surprise, even in suffering, the Allied spirit could not be broken. From the frozen forests of Belgium, the road now led east, to the Rhine, to Berlin, to the final reckoning. April 1945. When the snow melted. When the snows of the Ardennes finally melted, the truth was left behind in silence. Rows of crosses stretched across the hills where tanks once clashed and men froze in their foxholes. The birds returned before the bodies were buried. For Germany, it was the last breath before collapse. For America, it was the moment when courage and chaos fused into strategy. The Ardennes had begun as disaster, a surprise attack that shattered the Allied front. Yet, it ended as the ultimate trap. Every mile the Germans advanced, they sealed their own fate. Every drop of fuel burned, every tank abandoned, every veteran lost, all of it fed into a larger inevitability. The trap wasn't in the maps or the mines. It was in the logic of war itself. By turning crisis into endurance, the Allies revealed their greatest strength, not just firepower, but resilience. The kind that doesn't flinch when the world turns dark. What the German generals couldn't believe was not that America had held the line, but that it had turned its own defeat into victory. That from chaos, a calm determination had risen. That from confusion came clarity. The Battle of the Bulge showed that wars aren't always won by brilliance. Sometimes they're won by those who refuse to give up when every instinct tells them to. In the cold forests of Belgium, surrounded and outnumbered, American soldiers wrote a lesson that would echo through history, that the measure of an army is not in how it attacks, but in how it endures. By the time spring came, the Ardennes was quiet again. But history would remember the sound, not of defeat, but of defiance. The trap had closed. And with it, the Third Reich's final hope was buried in the snow.